Now, in the first half of this video 24, Weathering the Storm, we went through how it was that the Bolsheviks managed to recover their position after the defeat of the July days and indeed successfully organised strike action in protest against the state conference in mid-August. But in this video, The Masses Recover, I want to look back further at how the Bolsheviks and the masses in general had managed to win and regain that position. And let's start with some important points made by Trotsky in his history. The political development of the masses proceeds not in a direct line, but a complicated curve. Objective conditions were powerfully impelling the workers, soldiers, and peasants toward the banner of the Bolsheviks. But the masses were entering upon this path in a state of struggle with their own past. At a difficult turn, the old prejudices, not yet burnt out, would flare up. The acuteness of the reaction to this partial defeat of the July days was in some sense a payment made by the workers and yet more the soldiers for their too smooth flow to the Bolsheviks during the preceding months. This sharp turn produced an automatic selection within the cadres of the party. Those who did not tremble in those days could be relied on absolutely in what was to come. On the eve of October, in allotting tasks, the organisers would glance around, calling to mind who bore himself how in the July days. The July reaction established a kind of decisive watershed between the February and October revolutions. The blow was in reality psychological rather than physical, but it was no less real for that. During the first 4 months, all the mass processes had moved in one direction, to the left. Now, this inner crisis in the mass consciousness caused confusion and retreat. These receding waves in the flood of revolution developed an overwhelming force. You cannot conquer such a wave head-on. Hold out until the wave of reaction has exhausted itself, preparing in the meantime points of support for a new advance. Now, the Bolsheviks had always had an influence out of all proportion to the meagre resources at their disposal. They lacked speakers, particularly to build the party outside Petrograd itself. The party's various publications had had a total circulation of around 320,000 up to the July days. Now this was cut by half. This limited circulation of the party press had always been countered by the Bolsheviks having ideas and slogans that corresponded to the needs and moods of the moment. So each paper was read and shared around the factories and barracks, while the bourgeois papers freely supplied to the front remained unopened, or as one division reported, burned to boil the water for tea. Trotsky notes that the agitation of the Bolsheviks was distinguished by its concentrated and well thought out character, a continual analysis of the objective situation, a testing of slogans upon facts, a serious attitude to the enemy, even when he was none too serious. And after the July days, such a serious analysis was vital. So in spite of all difficulties, the planned 6th Congress of the Bolshevik Party went ahead from July the 26th, its sessions concealed in 2 different workers' districts. Now, the Congress was officially a joint Congress, planned to bring about the inclusion of various independent groups into the Bolsheviks. Most important of these was the Mezhryansky, the Petrograd inter-district organisation that Trotsky, Lunacharsky, Joffe and other revolutionaries belonged to. And Trotsky writes about his own political developments as follows. It was only at this July Congress that Trotsky formally joined the Bolshevik Party. The balance here was struck to years of disagreement and factional struggle. Trotsky came to Lenin as to a teacher, whose power and significance he understood later than many others, but perhaps more fully than they. And in his history, Trotsky describes how there were 175 delegates representing 112 organizations and around 177,000 members in all. There were 36,000 Bolsheviks in Petrograd, plus the 4,000 Mezhrayontsy and 1,000 in the military organization. The party had 42,000 members in the industrial regions around Moscow, 25,000 in the Urals, 15,000 in the Donetsk Basin, and significant numbers in some of the main cities of the Caucasus. Lenin, Trotsky, Zinoviev and Kamenev received most votes in the elections for the Central Committee, although Trotsky was now in prison and the other three couldn't risk attending the Congress. Nevertheless, Lenin's theses formed the basis of the discussions. Trotsky writes that invisibly present at the Congress, Lenin introduced into its work a spirit of responsibility and audacity. He knew that an incorrect economic formula, like an inattentive political observation, takes cruel vengeance in the hour of action. In defending his fastidiously attentive attitude to every party text, even the secondary ones, Lenin said more than once, "This is not a trivial detail. We must have accuracy. Agitators will learn this and not go astray. We have a good party," he would add, having in view just this serious, meticulous attitude of the rank-and-file agitator upon the question of what to say and how to say it. And unlike back in April, the unity of the meeting was noticeable. The Congress, guided by Lenin's theses, confirmed the party's warnings against being drawn into premature conflicts, but also explained the need to prepare for an armed insurrection. And in doing so, interestingly, the Congress withdrew the central slogan of the previous period, "All power to the Soviets." Because before the July days, a peaceful transfer of power to the Soviets, followed by the winning of a Bolshevik majority within them, had seemed possible, but no longer. Trotsky writes, "If the Executive Committee should now have decided to introduce a resolution transferring the power into their own hands, the result would have been wholly different from before. A Cossack regiment would probably have entered the Tauride palace to arrest the usurpers. The slogan 'Power to the Soviets' from now on meant armed insurrection against the government and those military cliques which stood behind it. But to raise an insurrection in the cause of power to the Soviets, when the Soviet leaders didn't want it, was obvious nonsense. The new demand would have to be the candid slogan of the conquest of power by the proletariat and the peasant poor. This was not a renunciation of the Soviets as such. After winning the power, the proletariat would have to organize the state upon the Soviet type. But these would be other Soviets, directly opposite to the defensive function of the compromise Soviets." Now, to finish this section, Trotsky explains how the masses began to recover. The industrialists had sought to take advantage of the workers' weakness in July by going on the offensive, and a key part of their strategy had been deliberate economic sabotage, closing down factories, concealing raw materials, even deliberately flooding mines and destroying machinery. But the workers had responded with a wave of strikes. While the more experienced layers still held back, fresher workers, like those in the textile, leather and paper industries, had come to the fore. And as time went on, the slander against the Bolsheviks began to lose its effect in the factories. After all, it was hard to believe your workmate was a German spy when you'd known him for years. It had only taken days for the most politically advanced workplaces in Petrograd to recover. They started to mount protests against the arrests and slanders. By the end of July, the Bolsheviks had regained their position in Petrograd's factories and were able again to carry out agitational work in the city. Bolshevik speakers toured meetings around Petrograd. The 50,000 strong Union of Youth was also coming under increasing Bolshevik influence. And even the soldiers began to wonder, well, if the Bolsheviks are German spies, why does the news come chiefly from sources most hateful to the people, the cadet press? Why, in accusing Lenin and so on, do they shake their fists in the very faces of soldiers as though they were the traitors? And then, on July the 21st and 22nd, just as the compromisers and bourgeoisie were wrangling over their new coalition, a far more significant coalition began to form between the soldiers and the workers. Delegates from the front had been arriving in the capital to try and meet with the Soviet EC to protest at the restoration of the old regime's methods at the front. But the EC refused to meet them. Instead, encouraged by the Bolsheviks, the delegates went to discuss with the workers and soldiers of Petrograd. And these discussions then led to a conference being called from below, with representatives from 29 regiments at the front, 90 from Petrograd factories, plus delegations from the Kronstadt soldiers and other surrounding garrisons too. Trotsky puts it like this: the Petersburg workers listened to the men from the front eagerly. These grey soldiers painted in unstudied words how everything was crawling back to the old hateful regime. The contrast between the hopes of yesterday and today's reality struck home to every man there. A Bolshevik resolution was passed almost unanimously. The dispersing delegates will tell the truth about how the compromised leaders repulsed them and the workers received them, and the trenches will believe their delegates. These meetings with representatives from the front helped the Petrograd garrison to recover, although some of the regiments, most of the fought in July, still retained their caution and apathy after defeat. The Bolshevik military organization started to get back on its feet, helped by the involvement of Sverdlov and Dzerzhinsky from the Central Committee. The party also began to recover in Kronstadt and amongst the sailors based at Helsingfors. By August, a Bolshevik, Brechman, was elected president of the Kronstadt Soviet. As Trotsky puts it, the soldiers had been to a considerable degree the instigators of the July movement, acting over the head of and to an extent against the will of the party. The experience had shown them that the question of power is not so easily solved. Semi-anarchistic moods had now given place to confidence in the party. And after some delay, Moscow began to take the same road as Petrograd, as soon became clear, as I've said, in the strength of the strike against the state conference. Events at the conference itself further accelerated that leftward mood of the masses and the growth of the Bolsheviks. The leftward shift of Petrograd's Mensheviks was shown when they voted to exclude Tsereteli from their election list for the City Duma. Then the city's social revolutionaries voted to dissolve the reactionary League of Officers at headquarters. On August the 18th, nearly all of the 900 delegates to the Petrograd Soviet voted to demand the abolition of the death penalty. Only 4 votes were cast against, and they were the leading compromisers: Tsereteli, Chidze, Dan and Lieber. The Petrograd Duma elections on August the 20th saw the social revolutionaries losing votes, although still with a larger share, at 37%. The cadets winning 1/5 of the poll, but the Mensheviks only on a pitiful 4%. However, to everyone's surprise, it was the Bolsheviks that won 1/3 of the total poll. Similar strides forward for the Bolsheviks were demonstrated in elections and conferences right across the country. For example, the party had recovered sufficiently in Kiev to handsomely win a majority at a conference of factory and shop committees held on August the 20th. So in conclusion, from February onwards, despite an inevitable lagging behind and sometimes deliberate postponement of elections, the changing fortunes of the parties had been reflected in the makeup of the Soviets. With increasing Bolshevik influence came also an increasing involvement of the Soviets in the direct administration and control of local industry, agriculture and justice. By early July, many provincial Soviets, such as those in the Urals, were already in effect organs of power in their localities. This was already anticipating the Soviet organisation following the revolution. Of course, the July days cut right across this development. While the role of parties and unions still seemed clear, even in a time of reaction, in the aftermath of the July days, it was unclear whether the Soviets had any future at all. Instead of Soviet power, control by the government and its commissars had been strengthened instead. Other functions were being transferred to the factory committees and municipalities. Indeed, Lenin was coming to the opinion that the compromised Soviets might just wither on the vine, and that it would be the Bolshevik-led factory committees that were likely to become the organs of insurrection. After all, the Moscow strike against the State Conference had been called from the factories against the opposition of the Moscow Soviet leaders. Trotsky points out that Soviets are revolutionary bodies, and unless being used for the struggle for power, begin to lose their purpose. The compromised leaders of many of the Soviets no longer sought to use their power, giving way to the bureaucracy instead. So many Soviets turned into pointless talking shops. Despite that, the number of Soviets overall was still growing, reaching 600 by the end of August, as the idea was now beginning to take hold in more backward counties and regions. But the decline in the fortunes of the Soviet Executive Committee even allowed the government to push the EC out of the Tauride Palace and into the Smolny Institute. But later in July, a revival of the Soviets had already started, from the bottom up, as the Bolsheviks began to restore their support in the districts of Petrograd. Their demands at first were limited: against mass arrests, for restoration of the left press, for an end to the disbandment of the regiments and the death penalty at the front, for example. But by August, as well as in Kronstadt, the Bolsheviks were winning Soviet majorities in a number of areas, and more radical slogans were starting to be raised, including once again the transfer of power in the Soviets. Trotsky notes that after the temporary halt in its growth, Bolshevism again began confidently spreading its wings. "The compensation is coming fast," wrote Trotsky in the middle of August. "Driven, persecuted, slandered, our party has never grown so swiftly as in recent days. And this process will not be long, in running from the capital to the provinces, from the cities into the village and the army. All the toiling masses of the country will have learned, when new trials come, to unite their fate with the fate of our party."